Ghost Man by Austin Smith. When the jack slipped, the manure spreader fell squarely on his thighs, or into them, it felt like, breaking both femurs neatly, almost efficiently in two. After a moment of shock, John Anderson screamed. He screamed with all the breath that was in him, and the scream was also efficient, something that had to be gotten through. The scream spooked the birds nesting in the rafters of the atrium-like machine shed. About half took flight and flew through the open double doors and out over the April fields. It was a late spring and cool, and there was still snow amongst the shattered shin bones of last fall's corn, but the weather was poised to turn. Things were getting ready to do some living, and even his scream could be said to have had life in it, because it was full of blood and disbelief, though, as he began to faint, he thought he had known somehow that the jack was about to slip. He thought he remembered, on the other side of the guillotine of that moment, starting to try to crawl out from under there. But maybe this was just his mind trying retrospectively to save his body, substituting a memory where there was none. Then he fainted. He had no idea how long he'd been out, but when he came to, the pain was gone. The weight of the spreader, which included the weight of the crusted manure he could never quite get hosed off, acted as a tourniquet, cutting off all sensation below his mid-thighs. It wasn't that he couldn't feel his feet. He had none to feel. Raising his head with difficulty off the seed sack he'd laid down so as not to get all dusty, a futile precaution it seemed to him now, he saw what was pinning him. It was one of the crossbars. He'd never considered the crossbar before. In all the years he had pulled the spreader behind him in the shed or the fields, in the winter or the summer, and now it was the most significant object in his life. The spreader was cantilevered a little, because one wheel was completely off, and the other was just dead flat. There was blood, but it looked no different from engine oil in the chaffy dust, and he figured the veins were all pinched like kinked hoses. He tried to imagine his legs on the other side of the bar, but they seemed as far as death, which wasn't that far all of a sudden, he realized, but which was still as inconceivable as it had always been. He patted his jeans pockets for the cell phone, knowing it was on the workbench, as capable of helping him now as the myriad wrenches strewn like bones all around it. He craned his neck and looked somehow back behind him, over his head, and saw through the double doors. It was still early afternoon. 2 o'clock, probably, he said. It was the first thing he'd said since the scream, and he didn't so much say it as rasp it. Hearing his own voice almost made him cry, because it was the voice of a scared boy. Thinking of himself as a boy made him think about baseball. And thinking about baseball made him think about his legs. He was 58. The girls had both left after high school. He was proud of them both. They'd married men he approved of and had made good lives for themselves. The older, Amy, had 3 boys and lived outside St. Louis. The younger, Kathleen, was still trying to get pregnant. She lived clear down in Kansas City. Cities. His wife was in Chicago. On the shopping trip she took every spring with her girlfriends. Of all times to go to Chicago, to go shopping, he thought. Or maybe, of all times, to have a manure spreader fall on her legs. John thought of her walking down Michigan Avenue. He'd never thought of his wife's legs as being especially beautiful, but they seemed marvelously so to him now. It wasn't warm enough yet for women to be wearing dresses in Chicago, but he decided if he couldn't use his legs, he could use his imagination. In his mind, she'd just bought a red dress in one of the stores she couldn't afford on the Magnificent Mile, which could have been any of them, and she'd worn it right out of the store. He saw her girlfriends cutting the little translucent plastic ties of the tags with paring scissors. There were lots of tags. It was that kind of dress. And he saw them surrounding her, and his wife sort of turning around in a stunned fashion, beginning to smile like a bride getting measurements taken. Then they were walking down the bustling sidewalk, and he could just see her legs. his didn't hurt. They were too pinned to. He had the idea they were no longer his, that they'd gone back to being the legs of his boyhood again. He thought of the seed sacks he and his two brothers and sister used to set on the yard for bases, how when their dad was too tired or busy to pitch, John, the oldest, would. Then they'd have to call the ghost man out of the corn, if there was corn, and since they usually played baseball in summer, there almost always was. "Ghost man! Oh, ghost man!" they'd cry out gleefully. "We need you now!" And out of the corn he'd come. Someone's dead son, near to crying because some kids were being nice to him and inviting him to play. Now, his thighs and torso were a purple sky, and every now and again there would flare in it red lightning. John lay there gazing up at it, his body having become the firmament hovering over him, and watched it like folks watch fireworks from a hill just outside of town. It was painful when the lightning flared like that, but it was beautiful also, and so much that is beautiful is painful, if not all of it. He thought this. He was conscious that his thoughts were getting funny, and he felt he might faint again. If he did faint, and he dreamed, he prayed he'd dream about baseball and the invisible legs of the ghost man who was more accurately a ghost boy. But something wouldn't let him faint. The birds had long since settled back into the shed, and a robin, he thought it was perched lightly upon the spreader, singing. No, it wasn't singing, and it wasn't a robin. He didn't know what it was, probably one of those nameless small birds that flit from fence post to fence post on a farm, and it never paid much attention until a moment like this. The bird seemed to be asking him something. Its call went up in pitch and sounded curious, if not interrogatory. Suddenly, John understood the bird as if it were speaking English. It wanted to know why he'd fired the hired hand, implying that if the hired hand were there, he'd be out from under this mess by now and might not have to lie there all night while his wife slept in a room 53 floors above the streets of Chicago and his cows nearly exploded with milk. "Because he watched the goddamn barn radio," he said. But not really. His voice was totally gone. He just mouthed the words. Then he mouthed apologies to God, whom John did believe in, albeit not very fervently. The tiny weight of the questioning bird caused that much more pain. There was pain now. It was rich and complex, like very good wine. It was like the pain of childbirth, he imagined. She'd always said he was lucky. He would never have to experience pain like that. And when he'd wanted to try for a son, she'd said, "Oh no, never again." Now, here he was, feeling a pain he imagined was at least comparable, and she wasn't even there for him to brag about it to. She was in a red dress, in Chicago. He'd probably stopped somewhere for coffee, not wanting to spend any more money and not knowing what else to do. They'd all probably kicked their shoes off under a table in a Starbucks on the 3rd floor of some department store, and were gazing out the windows at the city from a great whitish cloud of bags, like angels. Why had he fired Eric? Well, the kid was an imbecile. When John had told him to wash everything in the parlor, he'd assumed even Eric was bright enough to know this excluded the radio and other electrical appliances. He'd scrubbed out the sockets like he was a mother and they were kids' ears. The word ears brought him back to corn, and corn brought him back to baseball. He had an idea. He called out, "Please, God, please lift this spreader off my legs." When the spreader seemed to sink a little heavier upon him, maybe another bird had landed on it, he nodded, the back of his head hushing against the cement floor, and said, "Hey, ghost man, if you're out there, I need you." He looked to his right. He hadn't really looked that way because that was toward where the jack had been, and he didn't want to think of the jack or the moment it had slipped. But looking that way now, he saw bare feet and naked ankles widening into hairless shins, and a boy's bony knees. The spreader started at his thighs, about where the bar was on his. The legs sort of swayed, like the boy was waiting for someone, or the way a boy's legs will sway when he's way out in the outfield, and it's clear no one playing has the muscle to hit a ball out to where he is. The legs didn't seem involved with John at all. They were just there. From time to time, one of the heels would lift and the toes would bend to white, but that was all. John reached out to try and touch the feet, but couldn't quite reach. In a way, he was relieved. He was afraid if he touched them, they'd disappear. On the workbench, his phone rang. It was a stupid ring. It was the default that had come with the phone, and he'd never figured out how to change it. No one ever called it anyway. They called the house or the barn phone, and he was too far from both to hear them. It must be her, he thought. She'd probably tried the house at lunch, and the barn just now that it was milking time, and she was becoming worried. When the ring fell silent, he knew she was leaving him a message. He saw her ducking in the entryway to an office building, in out of the wind, wasn't it always windy there? Scolding him for not picking up, then forgiving him, beginning to tell him about her day, what all she bought, bragging about all the great deals she found, lying about how much she'd spent, and knowing he'd know she was lying. It was all for him anyway. She'd be home tomorrow before noon, and over the course of the next few days would wear every item of clothing and pair of shoes she'd bought, and he'd whistle and say, "How much did that cost me?" And she'd have bought him 2 nice shirts, and he'd wear the first Friday night when they went out for fish, and the second at Mass on Sunday, where he'd get right down on his knees and thank God for restoring his legs to strength in just 3 days. He'd be wearing the new slacks she'd have bought him to go with both new shirts, and he'd sit back in the pew, settling his shoulder against hers. She'd be wearing the red dress, and the other wives would whisper to their husbands that it wasn't the sort of dress that should be worn to Mass. And he'd smooth the khaki fabric out on his unmaimed thighs and gaze up at the ceiling. He gazed up now at the chain he'd been under there trying to fix. After a few decades, it had finally decided to pop off, which meant manure backing up in the barn. Pulling it into the shed to back off the chain, he'd run over a board with a great big nail sticking up out of it, which had fallen from the roofer's truck earlier that week, and which he'd neglected to pick up. They'd just finished putting a new roof on the granary. He tried to blame them for the situation he was in now, but he was the one who'd walked past the board a dozen times without stopping to move it out of the way. Anyway, he couldn't seem to get any anger up. He was thirsty. He turned and saw the boy's legs were still standing there. There was a Band-Aid on one knee he hadn't noticed before, as if the boy had wandered off and scraped it somehow. "Lend me a hand here, would you, kid?" he asked, and laughed at the expression. Hands were appendages he still had, and the boy lacked. He remembered that at 4, the mail lady would come. She'd pull up between the house and the shed, but just his luck, she was deaf. She'd driven a school bus for years until they figured out she might not hear a train whistle at a crossing and fired her. But because she knew every farm and road in Pearl County already, the post office hired her up as a kind of mid-career acquisition. She probably wasn't actually deaf, just hard of hearing, but with a corrugated tin wall between her and where he lay, John was pretty sure she wouldn't hear him, even if he had still a voice to scream with. Maybe she'd noticed the cows bunched restlessly around the parlor entrance, dripping milk from their udders, but he doubted she'd notice anything miss at all. The farm was as quiet as most dairy farms are at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. The only other possibility he could imagine was that a salesman might drop by. He'd never wished so badly for a salesman to drop by. He promised himself he'd buy whatever they were selling, even if they were selling new manure spreaders. His phone rang again. That was a good sign. It meant his wife's annoyance might be turning to worry. One more call and she might decide to give the neighbors a ring. Irv Olson and John Anderson hated each other because they saw themselves as the last representatives of a multi-generational land dispute that had started somewhere way back up, or was it down, the trees of their fathers, but John figured No man hated another man enough to find him pinned under a manure spreader and walk away. He didn't hear the phone ring once more. He'd fainted again, nor did he hear the deaf woman pull up on the wrong side of the road to deliver the mail, which was 6 bills, 3 glossy catalogs, 2 for clothes and 1 for hybrid seeds, and a letter from Amy. She was writing to wish them a happy Easter and to ask if early June would still be a good time to visit. She and the boys wanted to know, would there be calves then? She said she knew he'd like to get rid of the calves as soon as possible, but maybe he could hang on to a few so the boys could feed them. On the front of the card was a picture of the world's largest watermelon. The cattle were bellowing. One cow mounted another pathetically, then slipped off. Milk was dripping from their udders into the dust like the first drops of rain in a dry season. Down the road, Irv's phone rang. He ignored it, because he just shocked himself on a wire he would have sworn wasn't hot, and he didn't want to be cross with whoever it was that was calling. 3 or 4 birds had settled on the edge of the spreader now. Their cracked yellow feet were older than they were, and their claws were sharp, and the color of Elmer's glue dried at the tip of the nozzle. When John came to, he was standing beside the spreader, in the body of a boy, wearing blue shorts splotched here and there with white paint that would never wash out, and a tattered gray t-shirt that had proclaimed something once but was now just flecks of color like old birthday cake frosting. Sticking out from under the spreader, he could see his boots, flopped this way and that like the boots of a man taking a nap in the shade of his machinery. Not wishing to disturb himself, John walked outside. He figured he had died, but was amused by the fact that when you die, you become a child again. He thought of all those evenings he and his brothers and sister would turn to the corn and call for the ghost man to join them. The whisper that invariably shivered through the leaves had been a spirit. He knew now, though for years he chalked it up to childhood imagination. And he laughed to think how all the Sundays of his life he'd sat in the pews of St. John the Baptist trying to conceive of the afterlife. And here it was. You simply began again in youthful vigor and joy. Apparently, heaven is being a child again on the earth, he thought. But nice as this was, he wished there was someone around to talk to. He started walking across the fields. He wanted to find some kids his own age. It was a long time until deep summer. The corn wasn't even in the ground yet, but once it got to be about as high as his head, that's when the kids would all be let out of school. Then, if he found the right farm and just stood at the field's edge, real still, after a while, one of the kids would notice him standing there. Probably one of the girls or the most sensitive boy. If they were children, it must mean they had died once too. And with the words and gestures they used in that world, he believed they would call and motion for him to come out of the tick-infested, scratchy corn and join them